I'm ready to beam the warp on my rigid heddle loom now that I have threaded all the slots in the rigid heddle reed. To do this, I'm going to do my usual thing of grabbing a roll of coral buff, which is a colored gridded um, bulletin board art supply, to use as my warp separator. It did occur to me, and I can't believe it took me so long to think about this, that if I use something thinner on my rigid heddle loom, even at full weaving width, it would cause less havoc bumping into the attachments for the ratchet dogs. But this is a narrower warp, a narrower project requiring a narrower warp separator. So I don't think I'm going to have as much trouble bumping into the hardware that holds the ratchet dogs on. So I've reached a point where I'm ready to start putting in the warp separator. And at the moment, I don't have any tension on my warp, which will become a problem very quickly. So I'm just basically going to fix this warp separator in place, and then I'm going to start tugging on my warp chains. And see, it already came out. Okay, so we do it again. It's no big deal. Get the warp separator into place, square it up so that it rolls on evenly. This time I'm going to go a little bit farther so it doesn't fall out when I start adding some tension. And the thing about rigid heddle looms as opposed to floor looms is that you want to put tension on the warp very close to the rigid heddle reed. And so you can hear the warp beam squeaking as I turn it. And that's because I'm holding on pretty tightly to my rigid heddle, to my warp ends. Okay, and I'm going to stop at this point. I'm going to tug some of the slack out of the warp separator. Because remember, when I first started, I didn't have any tension on it. And then I'm going to just do this again. And this is a really short warp, so it's going to beam super duper quickly. And part of the reason I'm trying to put so much tension on this is, remember, the whole point of beaming is to beam as evenly as possible. You want your warp to stay, all the individual threads to stay the same length as you do this. And that requires a reasonable amount of tension on this warp chain. And even though this is only a 15-inch wide warp, what would be ideal is if I had, well, two more hands, which isn't really feasible, but another pair of hands to hold from the front while I beam at the back. But since I'm only one person and not an octopus, unfortunately, I have to do it this way. And notice how the reed is combing out any snarly bits as I go through. And that's really important. You want that to be happening. Okay, now I want to show you one last thing before I cut the end of the warp chain. And I'm moving the camera to do it. I mentioned when I was threading the reed, that you do get problems with, not just with slack, but just simple geometry. That if you're warping to a narrow point, which is the warping peg, of necessity, the warp ends on the ends are going to be longer than the warp ends in the middle because they're going on diagonal. So even if I had warped this loom, if I had kept even tension throughout the entire process of warping this loom, I would have had this problem. And it's why, in fact, a 30-inch flip loom from Shack comes with two warping pegs so that you've got 2 points and there's less draw in when you're making a really wide warp. Now, since I work for Shack and it's not that hard anyway, we sell warping pegs just on their own if you need a replacement part for your cricket or flip. Because I do weave on this 25-inch flip, full widths with some regularity, I think it would be a smart investment for me to get a second warping peg. So even if I had warped at perfect tension, I think that I would have run into this problem, but I was not warping at with perfect tension. And so you can see right here that my loops are not all the same length. If I had worked a warp chain on a warping board, this would have been less of a problem. But my outside ends are considerably shorter than the ones in the middle by a couple of inches even. So to fix that, we've got our trusty pair of scissors. And so I'm just using the front beam of my loom as a reference, and I'm just going to cut. And now, and I'm just cutting in small groups. When all the warp ends are closer to the same length, yep, it always hurts watching that yarn just drop to the floor. And again, cutting in relatively small bursts. Just trimming everything to the same length. And now, when I tie onto the front apron bar, I can adjust the tension and make sure I've got even tension. So the last time I direct warped this loom for my V-shaped wrap, I set the warp chains on the floor with weights, and it turned out that that did not work terribly well. I had one section in the warp chain, one color section, that was just at a different tension, and I had problems weaving that particular section all the way through the project. So the time I spend now evening out, making sure that my warp is beamed properly, will pay off later. When I come back to the V-shaped wrap to show you the last couple of steps, I'll talk about correcting mistakes and how I corrected that loose section of warp where one particular thread just was not at the same tension and caused problems all the way through.